Picture this, you sit down with some of the greatest artists in history and receive advice so profound and powerful, it completely transforms your entire illustration career. In this episode, I'm going to tell you exactly what that advice would be. Welcome to the Self-taught Illustrator. My name's Natasha, aka @Natashko, and I'm here to prove that you do not need a formal training or background in art to make it as an illustrator. So listen up and get ready to be inspired, encouraged, and uplifted in your illustration journey. Hello, I'm back with another episode, and I'm genuinely so excited about this one. I've been feeling this renewed sense of purpose with these podcasts lately, and after connecting with some of you in the DMs following the last episode, it just reminded me how much I love creating this kind of content. Knowing that even a few of you are finding value and support on your illustration journeys just truly makes my day. So, with that being said, let's dive right in. When it comes to growing and evolving in your illustration practice, it shouldn't come as a surprise, but we all need mentors. People we can look to and learn from as we work towards reaching that next level in our craft. Now, I'm definitely not advocating for art school here, but one of the undeniable benefits of attending college or university for art is the built-in access to mentors. But for those of us who are self-taught illustrators, we need to get a little more creative. One option is to seek out mentors in real life. This might mean taking a class, enrolling in a course, or networking with people you admire. But of course, the downside is that these opportunities often come with a price tag. The people you would probably want as your mentors are usually very busy professionals who have to charge for their time and expertise. So, what are your other options? Essentially, we can turn to the vast wealth of knowledge left behind by people we admire. This could mean reading their books, listening to their podcasts, watching their presentations, or even studying their work. Even without face-to-face interaction, we can become their students and draw inspiration and guidance from them. From here, it's about extracting the meaning and the lessons that resonate with us and apply them to our own artistic journeys. Personally, I do this all the time. When I admire a particular artist, illustrator, or creative, I dive into their world to essentially figure out what would they do if they were me. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this episode. We are going to learn from some of the most famous and respected artists in history. We'll explore the perspectives, ideas, and teachings of some of art's greatest masters and see how their wisdom can apply to a modern-day illustration practice. Now, of course, these were human beings with their own flaws and limitations, and we might not agree with everything they said or did, but we'll focus on the lessons that are relevant and helpful to us as illustrators today. I'll also be suggesting actionable exercises or assignments, if you will, that I imagine each of these artists might give us to push our creative practices forward. Whilst creating this episode, I found myself so excited about these exercises that I couldn't resist diving in and trying out one for myself. I chose the assignment inspired by the very last art master that we'll discuss later in the episode, and I was genuinely thrilled with the outcome. And I can't wait to share more about that once we get to it. Okay, so let's start off with Leonardo da Vinci. Even if you're not super into art history, you've definitely heard of him. He's the guy behind the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. But Leonardo wasn't just a painter, he was a Renaissance man, an inventor, a scientist, an engineer, an anatomist. He was constantly sketching and studying the world around him, and his notebooks were packed with detailed drawings of everything from human anatomy to flying machines. Leonardo had this insatiable curiosity about absolutely everything. One of his most famous quotes is, "Learning never exhausts the mind." He believed in exploring and understanding the world as deeply as possible, and that curiosity fueled his creativity. He didn't just draw what he saw, he actually dissected real human bodies to understand how they worked. He studied the flow of water to better capture movement, and even designed machines that were centuries ahead of his time. So what does this mean for us as illustrators? It's about developing the same habit of curiosity and observation. Don't wait for inspiration to strike. Go out and seek it yourself. Study the things that fascinate you, even if they don't seem directly related to illustration. Leonardo's work teaches us that everything is connected. This is especially important for self-taught illustrators. It's so easy to feel like we've been on the wrong path for too long, or that we've come to illustration maybe a little too late in life. Maybe you have a degree or experience in a completely unrelated field, and it makes you feel like you're miles behind people who have been drawing their whole lives. But if Leonardo were here, I think he'd grab you by the shoulders, shake you, and tell you that nothing is wasted. In fact, all of the experience, whether it's from another career, field, or creative pursuit, is not just valid, it's actually necessary. It's part of what shapes you into the artist that you are today and that you will continue to grow into. Leonardo's life shows us that curiosity fuels creativity, and every path you've taken adds to your unique perspective as an illustrator. Leonardo once wrote this note to himself: "Describe the tongue of a woodpecker." Just think about that for a second. He was curious about something as specific as the tongue of a woodpecker. That level of attention to detail and curiosity is what made him such a master. It is a reminder that nothing is too small or insignificant to study, because those little details can bring so much richness to our work. Okay, so channeling the spirit of Leonardo, here is the actionable advice that I think he'd give you as a self-taught illustrator. Take a sketchbook and dedicate one page to observing something in extreme detail. It could be the folds in fabric, it could be a leaf, the mechanics of a hinge, or maybe your own hand making different gestures. The goal isn't to make a perfect drawing. It's to see and understand more deeply, just like Leonardo did. Push yourself to notice something that you've never really noticed before. It's about activating different parts of your awareness. And if you want to take it a step further, keep a little journal like Leonardo's. Write down the things you're curious about, so questions, observations, ideas, and make time to explore them through drawing. The more curious and observant you are, the better. Okay, so thank you to Leonardo. We are now going to look to Pablo Picasso, another one who you've definitely heard of before. He's one of the most famous artists in history and is often associated with works like Guernica and the creation of Cubism, a style that completely transformed how we think about art. What's so fascinating about Picasso, though, is that he never stayed in one place creatively. His art went through so many transformations, from his early realistic paintings to the abstract, fragmented works that made him famous. Picasso was like the master of reinvention. He's the perfect example of an artist who wasn't afraid to evolve. His career is often broken into these distinct eras, like his blue period, where he painted in moody blues and grays, and the rose period, which was lighter and full of warm pinks and oranges, and later came Cubism, where he deconstructed and reimagined art altogether. Each phase reflected what was happening in his life and his ever-changing view of the world. One of my favorite things about Picasso's journey is how unapologetically he embraced change. He didn't worry about what people expected of him. Instead, he allowed himself to follow his curiosity and explore new ways of expressing himself. That's such a powerful reminder for us as illustrators. Your work doesn't have to look the same forever. Growth and change are part of the process. So, what can we learn from Picasso's story? First, don't be afraid to reinvent yourself. It's so important to follow your curiosities and see where they lead you. Now, if you've been around here for a while and have listened to previous episodes of mine, you know that I've talked about the importance of having a strong, consistent personal style. And I stand by that. But like Picasso, I also believe that growth, development, and even changing course are not only allowed, but actually encouraged. That said, I wouldn't recommend jumping erratically between completely different styles with every single illustration you create. Instead, think of your work in terms of eras. If Picasso had Instagram, his feed wouldn't look like a chaotic mishmash of styles. You'd see distinct phases of his work, a clear evolution, basically a gradient of change happening over time. That's the kind of reinvention that allows you to grow while still building a cohesive body of work. Second, don't shy away from reflecting your personal experiences in your art. Picasso's blue period came from a place of sadness, and his rose period came from a happier, more optimistic time in life. Both phases are equally important in his body of work. And your emotions and experiences, whether they're joyful, challenging, or somewhere in between, can add depth and authenticity to whatever it is that you create. So imagine that you're at your desk or lounging on your couch, sketching away, and Picasso suddenly pops by, takes a seat next to you, and glances over at your illustration. Here's what I think he'd suggest. Take a step back and reflect on the phase or era you might be in right now. Even if you typically work with a set color palette, what would it look like if you reimagine this piece with the colors that best represent the current chapter of your life? And beyond color, how might this period also influence the actual style of your work? For example, if you're feeling at peace and in a calm state, could you incorporate perhaps smoother flowing shapes and lines? Or if you're experiencing chaos or discomfort, maybe the art will start to feel a little bit more jagged and fragmented. These are just a few examples, but take the time to really reflect on your feelings and think about how they might translate into your work, whether it's an illustration you're currently working on or one that you've recently completed. All right, now let's move on to the next master, Georgia O'Keeffe. She is an absolute icon. She's mainly recognized for her large-scale flower paintings, landscapes, and her unique interpretations of nature. She had a really special way of breaking down subjects into their simplest, most striking forms. She was best known for focusing on the essence of her subjects rather than capturing every single little intricate detail. In her famous flower paintings, for instance, she would blow up the flowers so much that they just became abstract shapes full of color and energy. If Georgia O'Keeffe had a catchphrase, I'd say it'd have to be, "Keep it simple, sweetie." Another key part of her work was her deep connection to the places where she lived. Similar to how Picasso had his distinct eras in his career, O'Keeffe's geography played a huge role in her art. For example, her time spent in New Mexico really profoundly influenced her, with the vast landscapes and rich colors of the region becoming some of the key central themes in her work. So, here's an exercise I think O'Keeffe could totally get behind. Choose an everyday object, a scene or maybe a flower, a landscape, or maybe even one of your own illustrated characters, and approach it with as much simplicity as you can. The goal is to strip away anything unnecessary and focus solely on the essence of the subject. Interestingly, this exercise is the complete opposite of what Leonardo suggested, but I digress. They can duke it out amongst themselves. Okay, so for the exercise, start by breaking down the object into its most basic forms. Think shapes, lines, and colors. Try zooming in and magnifying a portion of the subject, just as O'Keeffe did with her flowers. How can you make this subject feel larger than life while still keeping it super simple? And here's a fun thought. Think about scale too. As illustrators, we often work on very small screens, but imagine what your piece might look like as a massive print or a mural, for example. Thinking of how your work looks on a larger scale might unlock some new creative possibilities. Now, this exercise isn't about copying O'Keeffe's style. It's about understanding the power of simplicity in illustration. Her work teaches us how to transform ordinary objects into extraordinary pieces of art through attention to shape, form, and color. Her approach essentially encourages us to be more bold whilst creating work that still feels intimate and personal. Remember, keep it simple, sweetie. Alright, I hope you are enjoying this as much as I am. Now let's dive into the world of Rembrandt, another super famous artist. This Dutch legend is known for his mastery of light and shadow. It's so hard to fully appreciate just how much depth and dimension is in his work by just looking at it through your computer or through a phone screen. So if you ever have the opportunity to see a piece of his at a museum, that's when you'll get hit with the full impact of his art and just how real and alive his subjects feel. His work is just so juicy, I don't know how else to describe it. One of Rembrandt's greatest skills was his use of chiaroscuro, which is basically the dramatic contrast between light and dark. It's what gives his work that powerful three-dimensional feeling. And what's important for us to know is that he wasn't just painting light for the sake of it, he was using it to highlight emotion and tell a story. His work is full of depth, not just physically, but also emotionally. You can really feel the weight of his subjects' thoughts and struggles in their faces. So what can we, as modern-day illustrators, learn from Rembrandt? First and foremost, the way you use or don't use light in your work is absolutely key. Light and shadow are powerful tools that can bring depth, emotion, and focus to your illustrations. This is something that many beginner illustrators struggle with. Adding shading and highlights can feel intimidating. There's often this fear of messing up or not doing it right. But if Rembrandt were here, I think he'd tell you to start small and simple. Focus on just one light source to start off with, understanding where it's coming from, how it interacts with your subject, and how it creates shadows and highlights. That's all you need to get started. Once you're comfortable with the basics, you can start exploring further. Experiment with how the distance and the position of the light source affect your subject, or dive into even more advanced setups with multiple lighting sources. There are just so many fascinating variables to explore when it comes to lighting. But don't feel pressured to figure it out all at once. Just take it one step at a time. And if you're wondering how and where to learn about this stuff, I'd suggest YouTube. Look for beginner-friendly Shading 101 type tutorials and just go from there. Now, I have to jump in here with my own perspective on shading because let's be honest, I'm not sure Rembrandt could have ever even imagined the concept of digital art, let alone the difference between vector and raster graphics. As a modern day illustrator, you have so many options for how to express shadow and light, and none of them are inherently better than the others. It all comes down to your personal taste and style. For example, you might prefer really sharp, clean shadows. This is something that I often do, especially in my more minimal work. And if it's something that you'd like to explore, I'd really suggest looking at a software like Adobe Illustrator. It's better suited to creating those really nice, crisp edges. On the other hand, if you're drawn to soft, diffused, and more realistic shadows, a tool like Photoshop might be a better fit. I personally switch between these two approaches in my own work depending on the style that I'm aiming for. But here's the key takeaway. No matter what type of shadows you want to create or the software you're using, Rembrandt's imaginary advice still holds very true. Take the time to learn the basics of light and shadow. Mastering this foundational skill will elevate your illustration practice, no matter what tools or techniques you choose. If Rembrandt were assigning you homework, I imagine he'd ask you to take one of your illustrations and create multiple versions with the only difference being the light and shadow. Pay close attention to how these variations change the overall look and feel of your work. For example, if you're working with characters, how does the lighting affect how we perceive them and their emotional state? This exercise might reveal some really exciting and unexpected surprises and could even give you some new insights into how lighting could potentially transform your art. Alright, now let's jump forward to a slightly more contemporary artist, Hilma af Klint. This artist was ahead of her time, pioneering a spiritual and symbolic approach to painting long before abstract art became mainstream. Her work was so radical and unconventional for its time that it was considered absolutely groundbreaking. One key lesson that we can take from her is the importance of pushing creative boundaries and following our intuition. Even if what we create doesn't fit into the current trends or what's necessarily deemed as cool. Of course, in 2025, we don't really face the same sort of societal pressures or restrictions on the kind of art we create. But if there's something you truly love, something you believe in deeply, and perhaps you've feared others might not care or might even laugh at, I'm sure AF Klint would encourage you to funnel that energy into your work and shout it from the rooftops. Chances are, even if your audience is very small, there will be a group of people who resonate with your art, and you'll start to build a really strong following. Another fascinating aspect of AF Klint's work is her heavy use of symbolism. Throughout her career, people have debated and discussed the meaning behind the symbols in her art. However, Hilma herself never really extensively explained them. What we know about her symbols comes from her journals, notes, and letters, and even then, much of the meaning is still open to interpretation. Often, people assign their own meanings to her symbols based on their personal lenses. And that's perfectly fine. The beauty of symbolic artwork is that it can tell a different story to each viewer. So, how does this apply to illustration? Well, in your own practice, you might decide to incorporate more symbolism into your work. Like AF Klint, you might choose to create your own code for symbols. And whether you choose to share the meaning publicly or keep it private, it's completely up to you. However, it's important to note that some symbols already carry very strong meaning rooted in ancient cultures and religions. If you're interested in exploring this deeper, I highly recommend the book Symbols in Art by Matthew Wilson. It provides an in-depth breakdown of common symbols in art and what they represent. I'll link the book in the description for those curious about what elements like the moon, sunflowers, fish, eyes, mirrors, and many more can symbolize in art. Now, let's move to the Hilma af Klint inspired homework assignment. Start by choosing a concept or theme that resonates with you on a deep personal level. It could be an emotion, a memory, or a philosophical idea. You don't even have to share it with anyone if you don't want to. Now, instead of illustrating it literally, try and express it through abstract shapes, patterns, and colors. What colors represent calm to you? What shapes evoke energy and chaos? What symbolic elements can you incorporate to add meaning to your piece? And additionally, if you're drawn to her style, you might also want to experiment with layers and overlapping forms to convey depth and complexity. Layering shapes, colors, and imagery can create a sense of movement and interconnectedness. Think about where your eye first falls when you're looking at the piece, and then think about how you would guide that visual journey through the work. For illustrators, Hilma af Klint's legacy encourages us to go beyond surface-level aesthetics and infuse our work with deeper meaning and intention. Whether or not you resonate with this style or school of thought is completely up to you, but I hope it sparks some inspiration regardless. Alright, now we're at our second to last master artist. Let's dive into Henri Rousseau. Mainly known for his lush, dreamlike jungle scenes, Rousseau was a master of creating vivid, highly stylized, almost otherworldly landscapes. What's especially cool about Henri Rousseau is that he is completely self-taught. He started creating art relatively later in life, around the age of 40, after leaving his job as a customs officer in Paris. He had no formal training, and his early works were influenced by his love for nature and his vivid imagination. So first and foremost, Henri Rousseau is proof that it is never too late to get started in art. I even think that 40 is quite young, to be honest. There are countless examples of artists who didn't start till way later than Rousseau. So just snap out of it, it's not a real excuse. Okay, another key lesson we can learn from Rousseau is that a lack of formal training can actually be advantageous. His style was unique because it wasn't concerned with things like anatomical accuracy or perspective, for example. By being unbound and free from traditional artistic rules and having the courage to follow his own vision, Even in the face of criticism, he ultimately stood out and made his mark in the art world. I wanted to highlight Rousseau in this episode because I know that so many self-taught illustrators, especially when they're just getting started, can be really hard on themselves. Whilst being self-critical can be a great motivator for improvement, what if we embrace the naive, the crude, and the unrefined aspects of our work? What if we saw those qualities as something groundbreaking and fresh, never done before? Here's an exercise that I think Rousseau would have really appreciated. Think of something from your imagination or from your dreams and illustrate it with as much vividness and detail as possible. Now, normally I'm all for using reference images in art, but for this specific exercise, I challenge you to draw completely from memory. It actually reminds me of a project called Velocipedia by a designer called Gianluca Gimini, in which he asked people to draw a bicycle completely from memory, and then he made these 3D renderings based on their drawings. The results were hilarious, but also extremely charming and interesting to look at. As you can imagine, drawing something like a bike completely from memory isn't that easy. So for this exercise, don't look at a reference or the object you're drawing. Instead, picture it in your mind's eye, give it your best shot, and celebrate the imperfections and quirks of whatever it is that you're creating. Because ultimately, there is no one else in the world who will draw the way that you do. Even an artist with 50 years of experience won't be able to create the exact thing that's coming out of your brain. So try this out and who knows, you might just come up with a completely new way of thinking about your art and illustrations. All right, we have reached the final master artist of this episode, and I've saved her for last because she's one of my absolute favorites. I'm confident that by the end of this, you'll be just as obsessed with her as I am. Let's dive into the incredible work of Amrita Sher-Gil. She was an extraordinary artist from the early 20th century, known for blending her classical European training with deeply personal themes from her heritage. Born in Hungary and trained in Paris, Sher-Gil's early work reflected a really formal, classical European style. However, when she returned to India at the age of 21 to reconnect with her heritage, her art underwent this huge transformation. She began focusing on depicting rural life of Indian women, which ultimately led to the rich, multi-dimensional work that she's ultimately known for today. What's really fascinating about Sher-Gil's journey is how she took something established and infused it with her own unique perspective, creating something that was truly groundbreaking for its time. Her work is really a great reminder of the power of blending influences and following our instinct even if it goes against the grain. So, what can we, as modern-day illustrators, learn from Amrita Sher-Gil? The key lesson is the importance of finding your unique voice and staying true to your vision, even if it doesn't align with current trends. Many illustrators, especially when they're starting out, feel pressured to fit within a specific style or movement. But in reality, your style is just a blend of your influences, experiences, inspirations, and more. The more that you embrace and lean into what makes you, you, the more opportunity you will have to create truly unique and meaningful art. I talk about this in much greater detail in episode 27, so if you haven't listened to that yet, I highly recommend checking it out. But the takeaway here is the more that you can smush together the things that inspire and define you, the more extraordinary your work will become. Here's an exercise inspired by Amrita Sher-Gil. First, pick an artistic movement, style, or even the work of a particular artist that you're drawn to. Then think of something or maybe even a few things that are a specific part of your identity. These can be related to your heritage, but don't necessarily have to be. Even if you don't feel connected to a specific cultural tradition, consider what elements make your life and experiences unique. Now, once you have those elements, challenge yourself to create an illustration that combines all of them and just see what comes of it. I actually tried this exercise myself and I want to share my process with you to perhaps help spark some more ideas. So, for the artistic style, I chose Art Deco, specifically inspired by Tamara Delimpicka, who just happens to be another one of my personal heroes. And for the personal element, I decided to celebrate both my Polish heritage and my Australian nationality. At first, I wasn't sure how I was going to tie all of these elements together, so I just started sketching and let things flow naturally. I drew my female character in a way that I felt aligned with Dell'Empicka. Fortunately, that wasn't too far away from my usual style, but I also challenged myself to add some Art Deco elements, which took a little bit of effort, but I'm really pleased with how it came together. For the personal touch, I dressed my character in a traditional Polish national costume, aka strój krakowski, if you know, you know. And then to tie it all together, I incorporated Australian landscape colors and motifs into the illustration too. And the result? A piece that I'm genuinely excited about and super proud of. Something that I truly wouldn't have thought to create if it weren't for this Amrita Sher-Gil inspired exercise. For those of you who are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, you can check out the visual version on YouTube or Spotify podcasts to see my final artwork if you'd like. Now, if you decide to try out this or any of the other exercises in this episode, please let me know. Leave me a comment telling me which one you plan on trying, and don't forget to tag me in your finished piece. I really can't wait to see what you come up with. So, we just heard from 8 incredible masters of art who shared their creative philosophies and advice with us. And it's up to you to decide which of these do and don't resonate with you and your own creative journey. So just to recap what we heard today, first, Leonardo da Vinci reminded us to stay curious, be inquisitive, and follow our interests wherever they may lead. Pablo Picasso encouraged us to embrace our errors, to tune into our inner worlds, and create art that reflects those experiences. Georgia O'Keeffe inspired us to simplify and strip our art down to its essential elements. Rembrandt taught us about the transformative power of light and how it can evoke different moods and emotions in our work. Hilma af Klint urged us to use symbolism and imbue our art with layers of deeper meaning. Henri Rousseau wanted us to celebrate being self-taught and not let the lack of formal training hold us back from creating extraordinary illustrations. And Amrita Sher-Gil shows us the beauty of merging different influences, cultural, stylistic, and personal, to create something entirely unique. Okay, I hope this episode has inspired you to view your illustration practice with fresh eyes and new perspectives. If you enjoyed this and would like a part 2 of this series, let me know in the comments. I came across so many other fascinating art masters while researching for this episode, and I'd love to share them with you if that's something you want. And now it's time for the listener spotlight. In this episode, I'm highlighting the work of @itsSNADraws_ on Instagram. I'm really struck by her unique style, consistent color palette, and focus on fashion illustration. I'll leave her handle in the episode description if you want to check her work out and perhaps support one of your fellow self-taught illustrators. If you're a self-taught illustrator, I would love to give you a shout out and highlight your work in an upcoming episode. To be considered, leave a comment wherever you're listening, be it YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever. Tell me why you love the Self-Taught Illustrator podcast, and be sure to include your handle or website somewhere in the comment so I can look you up. So that's it for now. Thank you for tuning in to the Self-Taught Illustrator, where we prove that you do not need a formal training or background in art to make it and thrive as an illustrator. I'm @Natashko all over the web, that's NATASZKO, and you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. I look forward to bringing you more illustration tips, tricks, and nuggets of wisdom. All right, until next time, bye for now.